The courtroom fell silent. Justice Kavanaugh had just finished his argument, his words lingering in the air, thick with the weight of authority. The judge's eyes remained fixed on him, some with faint nods of agreement, others with skepticism barely concealed. A man who had built his career on forceful speeches and unshakable confidence. Kavanaugh had just delivered what he believed to be the final word. His voice reverberated through the room, but it was the silence that followed that spoke louder than anything he'd said. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, a calm in the storm. Her eyes were fixed on the papers in front of her, not a single flinch at Kavanaugh's challenge. The weight of history hung heavy in the room, but it wasn't on her shoulders. It was on his. But then, in that thick, oppressive silence, one voice broke through. A voice that would shake the very foundation of the room. Justice Kavanaugh, with all due respect, Jasmine Crockett began, her tone measured, but there was a fire in her eyes. She stood slowly, her presence already commanding the space. The room, frozen just moments ago, now shifted with anticipation. Her words, though few, carried the weight of something far greater. There was no grandstanding here, no bombastic flourish, just a simple, undeniable truth. You're wrong. And here's why. It was as if a spark had ignited a powder keg. The air crackled with tension. Kavanaugh's smug smile began to fade, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he prepared to respond. But in that instant, everyone in the room knew something monumental was about to unfold. The person who had just stood up, with nothing more than the sheer force of her conviction, was no ordinary opponent. She wasn't here just to win a case. She was here to shatter the myths he clung to. The fight wasn't about legalities anymore. It was about truth, justice, and the very idea of what America should stand for. But what happened next? It wasn't just an argument. It was a revelation, one that would leave everyone in disbelief, and it would all begin with this moment. The silence that had filled the room now seemed to echo. Jasmine Crockett's words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of one of the most powerful men in the room. Justice Kavanaugh, who had long believed his authority was unassailable, suddenly seemed less certain. His earlier confidence faltered just enough for everyone to notice. The stake had been raised, but it wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a battle for the heart of the country, a battle that would define what justice meant for generations to come. Jasmine knew that this moment was bigger than her, bigger than Kavanaugh, bigger than any single person in the room. It was about a system that had long favored the powerful, the wealthy, and the elite. It was about every person who had ever been silenced by those who believed they were above the law. She wasn't just fighting for a decision. She was fighting for the soul of America. The courtroom had become a stage, but this wasn't a performance. This was real, and everyone in the room felt it. Kavanaugh stood, his face a mask of arrogance, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had built his career on decisions that seemed to always swing in favor of the powerful, the privileged, and the institutions that kept the status quo intact. He had never been confronted like this before, not in such a direct, unyielding way. With all due respect, Justice Kavanaugh, Jasmine said, her voice steady but firm. This isn't just about one case. This isn't just about one ruling. This is about a pattern of decisions that have consistently ignored the voices of the people who need justice the most. Kavanaugh's lips tightened, but Jasmine didn't falter. She knew this wasn't just about winning the argument in the courtroom. This was about something deeper, something that transcended law books and legal jargon. This was about human dignity, about fighting for those who had been trampled by a system that had too long turned a blind eye. The audience, the press, even the judges, they were all watching closely now. The weight of what was happening was undeniable. They weren't just watching a courtroom drama. They were witnessing a defining moment in the nation's ongoing struggle for equality and justice. But what truly made this moment electrifying was the knowledge that Jasmine wasn't alone. Every marginalized group, every person who had ever been overlooked or ignored, was standing with her. The fight was no longer hers alone. It was a collective one, a fight for a more just inclusive America. What happens next? Jasmine continued. will determine if we are truly a nation of laws or a nation of men who believe themselves above the law. And I can promise you, it will not be the latter. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. No one moved. Even Kavanaugh stood frozen, momentarily disarmed, as if the weight of her words had struck harder than anything he'd anticipated. This was no longer just a legal debate. It was a clash of visions for America, one of progress and accountability versus one of privilege and preservation. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver from Kavanaugh's. "You may have the title, but you do not hold the truth," she added, her voice a quiet but unmistakable thunder. It was a line that would be remembered, but it wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The real battle had only just begun. Justice Kavanaugh stood firm, his eyes locking with Jasmine's, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. His once unshakable confidence now seemed like a fragile facade. He was a man who had spent his entire career in the corridors of power, insulated by influence and privilege. But in this moment, facing Jasmine Crockett, the weight of his past decisions threatened to collapse everything he'd built. Kavanaugh wasn't just a Supreme Court justice. He was a symbol of an establishment that had long ruled from a position of privilege. His rise to the bench had been swift, propelled by years of legal decisions that reflected a mindset steeped in conservatism, a worldview that valued stability over progress and tradition over reform. To those who had supported him, he was a defender of law and order, a man of unwavering integrity. But to those who had fought against him, he was a man who used his position to further entrench the systems of power that oppressed the vulnerable. Jasmine's words hung heavy in the room, but it wasn't just her challenge to his argument that rattled Kavanaugh. It was the truth in them, a truth he had spent years evading, masking, and justifying. Kavanaugh had long been a figure who embodied the elite, the untouchable class. From his time in law school to his tenure as a judge, he had walked the halls of power without ever having to confront the realities of those who struggled outside those hallowed doors. He was born into wealth, educated in the finest institutions, and ascended to the highest courts in the land without ever truly knowing what it was like to be on the other side of the law. But it wasn't just his privilege that defined him. It was his decisions. Time and time again, Kavanaugh had sided with the wealthy and the powerful. He had ruled in favor of corporate interests over individual rights, prioritized the preservation of the status quo over the pursuit of justice. His record was a testament to a man who saw the world through the lens of privilege, whose decisions reflected an understanding that the system was designed to work for him and those like him. It was during his time as a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that Kavanaugh's reputation began to solidify. His opinions were often seen as deeply conservative, his rulings designed to protect the interests of the powerful. Whether it was siding with corporations in environmental cases or ruling against women's reproductive rights, Kavanaugh had made it clear where his loyalties lay. And then there were the allegations, the dark stain on his confirmation process. The accusations of sexual assault, which had nearly derailed his path to the highest court in the land. The hearings had been explosive, with Kavanaugh vehemently denying the charges, claiming that they were part of a smear campaign designed to destroy his reputation. His reaction was one of fury, indignation, and deflection, as he lashed out at those who dared to question his character. But the truth was far more complicated. His confirmation had been marred by a bitter political struggle, with his opponents pointing to his history, his lack of empathy, and his partisan views as clear indicators that he was unfit to serve. For many, the scars from that battle remained fresh, and Kavanaugh had spent the years since carefully rebuilding his image, insulating himself from any further scrutiny. In the face of Jasmine's challenge, the walls Kavanaugh had so meticulously built began to crack. He had always believed that his position was secure, that his wealth and status had granted him immunity from the kind of scrutiny others faced. But now, in this moment, standing across from a woman who had nothing but her conviction, he realized that no title, no amount of power, could shield him from the truth. Jasmine Crockett was not just challenging his argument. She was challenging everything he stood for. She was the embodiment of the very forces he had spent his career trying to silence. The voice of the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten. She was the reckoning he had spent decades avoiding. And in that moment, as the weight of her words settled over him, Kavanaugh could feel something inside him begin to shift. For the first time, he wasn't in control. His usual deflection tactics weren't working. He wasn't facing an opponent who could be easily swayed by his position or his authority. Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the veneer of respectability that had cloaked his every move. The room grew colder. The tension was palpable. Jasmine had set the stage, and now Kavanaugh was being forced to confront the very core of his legacy. He had long prided himself on his rulings, on the power he wielded, but in this moment, he realized that his legacy was not just defined by the decisions he made in the courtrooms. It was defined by the people he had impacted and the lives he had left untouched. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from the halls of privilege. She didn't have a legacy of wealth or power to propel her forward. She was forged in the very struggles Kavanaugh had spent his career ignoring, and it was those struggles that made her the force of nature standing before him now. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Dallas, Texas, Jasmine knew hardship intimately. Her mother, a teacher, and her father, a construction worker, had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, sacrificing everything they had to ensure Jasmine and her siblings had the opportunity to build a better life. They weren't wealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination. They were middle class, but they had something far more valuable: resilience. From an early age, Jasmine was taught that if you wanted something, you had to fight for it. She saw her parents give everything they had to support their community, to teach the next generation, to make sure their kids could go to college. But she also saw how the system often failed them, how schools in her neighborhood were underfunded, how hospitals were overwhelmed, how the law seemed to protect the wealthy and punish the poor. That was when she decided to become a lawyer, not for the power, not for the prestige, but because she saw firsthand how the law could be used as a tool of oppression. She wanted to be the one who changed that, the one who stood up for those whose voices were ignored, whose rights were trampled. Jasmine worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship to one of the top law schools in the country. It wasn't easy. She often had to fight against stereotypes, biases, and financial struggles just to stay afloat. But she never gave up. She knew that the fight wasn't just about her. It was about the communities that had been ignored for far too long. It was about the workers, the immigrants, the people who had been left behind in a system designed to protect only the powerful. Her law school days were marked by her relentless pursuit of justice. She took on internships at public defense organizations, working with clients who had been wrongly convicted, victims of systemic racism, and people whose lives had been ruined by a broken justice system. It was here, in these trenches, that Jasmine learned the true weight of justice, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing thing that affected real people. Jasmine's commitment to fighting for the underdog led her to a career in politics. She knew that the legal system alone wouldn't fix the problem. She needed to get inside the system, change the laws, change the policies that kept people in poverty, that kept them oppressed, that kept them afraid. Her political rise was fast, driven by a clear message. Justice should be for everyone, not just for those with power and money. But it wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing minds. Jasmine understood that real change came when people could see that their struggles were shared, that they weren't alone. She became a voice for those who had been silenced for far too long. Whether she was addressing Congress or standing on a street corner, Jasmine made it clear that she would never back down. Not from the fight and not from the truth. Her rise wasn't without resistance. Many powerful figures, the very kind of people Kavanaugh had defended for so long, didn't like what she was saying. They didn't like the way she spoke about inequality, about privilege, about the systemic injustices that permeated every corner of society. But Jasmine didn't care. Every attack against her only fueled her resolve. The more they tried to silence her, the louder she became. And now, standing in that courtroom, facing Kavanaugh, Jasmine knew that this moment was her purpose all along. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. She was fighting for the dream her parents had given her, for the hope they had instilled in her, that one person, one voice, could make a difference. Kavanaugh had spent his career defending a system that oppressed people like Jasmine. But Jasmine wasn't here to tear down the system. She was here to remake it, to reshape it into something more, just something that worked for all people, not just the privileged few. It wasn't just about one case or one ruling. It was about the future of a country that was still grappling with its past, struggling to live up to the ideals it had promised. Liberty, equality, justice for all. As Jasmine stood there, ready to face Kavanaugh head-on, she realized that this moment wasn't about her own personal victory. It was about something much larger. It was about the fight for a fairer world, a world where justice meant something real, where it could be trusted, and where it was available to everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. And in this moment, Jasmine understood that she wasn't alone in her fight. She was the embodiment of every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had been told they didn't belong, every person who had been kept out of the room where decisions were made. Now it was time to change that. And Kavanaugh, for the first time in his career, would understand that he wasn't in control anymore. The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was fixed on the two figures standing at opposite ends of the courtroom. Jasmine Crockett had just laid down a challenge that would reverberate through the halls of power, and now it was Kavanaugh's turn. But the air felt different now, heavy with the weight of the truth she had spoken. No one was quite sure how he would respond, but the unease in the room was undeniable. Kavanaugh took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the papers in front of him. He wasn't just going to let this go. He had spent years building his reputation, his authority, and he wasn't about to have it dismantled by someone like Jasmine Crockett. She was nothing more than an upstart, a political firebrand with an agenda. At least, that's how he had always seen figures like her. People who spoke with passion, with emotion, without understanding the complexities of the law, the importance of preserving the system. But now, his arrogance was meeting an entirely different force. Jasmine wasn't just passionate. She was informed, calculated, and relentless. Her words weren't driven by emotion alone. She was using the law against him, pointing out the glaring contradictions in his own rulings, exposing the deep cracks in his ideology. She was standing up not just for herself, but for millions of Americans who had been marginalized by the very system Kavanaugh had sworn to uphold. Kavanaugh's jaw clenched as he began to speak, his voice steady but edged with irritation. With all due respect, Ms. Crockett, you seem to forget that the law is not about sentiment, he said, his words carrying the weight of years of authority. It is about precedent, stability, and the protection of the institutions that have made this country what it is. The crowd shifted, sensing the shift in tone. Kavanaugh was no longer speaking as a judge, detached and objective. Now, he was speaking as a man defending his beliefs, his vision of the law. And in his eyes, Jasmine had crossed a line. She wasn't simply challenging his ruling. She was challenging everything he stood for. Jasmine, however, remained unflinching. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. Her calm demeanor only served to amplify the force of her words. And yet, Justice Kavanaugh, she began, her tone controlled but unwavering. It is precisely the kind of thinking that has kept this country from moving forward. You talk about precedent, but what you fail to see is that the system you so fiercely defend has only ever protected the privileged, the ones who have the power, the money, and the connections. Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the edge of the table. You're implying that I don't understand the law, he said, his voice tinged with indignation, that I have failed to uphold the principles of justice. I'm not implying anything. Jasmine shot back, her words cutting through the air like a blade. I'm telling you that the principles you uphold are the very ones that have kept people like me, people like the ones I fight for, in a perpetual state of inequality. You talk about stability, but what you really mean is the stability of a system that works for people like you, and not for the rest of us. The room seemed to hold its breath as Kavanaugh struggled to respond. He had always prided himself on his ability to command the room, on his unshakable confidence. But in the face of Jasmine's truth, his words began to falter. He couldn't quite find the right response. This wasn't just a debate about legal principles. It was a confrontation of ideologies, of values. And for the first time, Kavanaugh realized that his rigid belief in the system wasn't enough to defend his position. Jasmine's voice remained calm, but there was a fire behind it. "The law is supposed to be about justice," she said, her eyes locked on Kavanaugh's. "It's not supposed to be about maintaining a system that keeps people like me out. It's not supposed to be about keeping the powerful in control while everyone else is left behind." The room was electric now. There was a palpable shift, an undeniable sense that something was happening here. For years, Kavanaugh had sat on his throne, defending a status quo that worked in his favor. But now, Jasmine Crockett had come to shatter that illusion, and she wasn't going to stop until she had done just that. Kavanaugh, clearly flustered, tried once more to regain control. "Ms. Crockett, you are entitled to your opinion, but the law isn't opinion." Jasmine cut in sharply. "The law is meant to protect people. All people, not just those who have the means to fight back. And that, Justice Kavanaugh, is where you've gone wrong." The force of her words landed like a punch to the gut. Kavanaugh's expression tightened, his face reddening as the weight of her challenge settled in. The room, once filled with the comfort of legalese and precedent, now hummed with the tension of something far deeper, a reckoning. The back and forth between them had escalated from a simple legal argument to a battle of values. Values that were not just rooted in law, but in the very fabric of what America stood for. Jasmine wasn't just making a point. She was exposing the system for what it was, a system that for too long had failed to deliver justice for all. But what would Kavanaugh do now? Would he continue to cling to the law as it was? Or would he be forced to reckon with the fact that the law, in its current form, was broken? As the debate raged on, it was clear that the stakes had risen higher than anyone had anticipated. And the outcome of this clash, this war of ideologies, would decide more than just the fate of one case. It would determine the future of a nation. The room was now electric, crackling with tension as Kavanaugh's last words hung in the air. He had tried to regain control, tried to dismiss Jasmine's challenge as little more than emotional rhetoric. But as he glanced around the room, he could feel the shift, the unease in the air, the discomfort on the faces of the judges, the murmurs from the press. For the first time in his career, Justice Kavanaugh realized that he was no longer in command. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke again. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her words were precise, calculated, each one landing like a carefully aimed strike. She had already dismantled his argument point by point, but now she was about to reveal the true heart of her challenge, the reason she was standing before him, unyielding and unafraid. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said, her voice steady but piercing, "you talk about the law as though it is above reproach, as if it is some untouchable, sacred thing that must remain unchanged. But let's be clear, the law, in its current form, has never been neutral. It has never been just, and it certainly hasn't been fair to the people who need it the most." The words were like a shockwave, reverberating through the room. Kavanaugh's lips tightened as she continued, each syllable stripping away the veneer of respectability he had spent decades building. "You call yourself a protector of the Constitution," Jasmine went on, her gaze unwavering. "But how can you claim to protect the Constitution when you've used it as a shield to defend the very system that has disenfranchised millions? You speak of equality, but you've made rulings that perpetuate inequality. You say you uphold justice, but you've twisted the law to protect the powerful and punish the powerless." Kavanaugh's hand clenched around the edge of the table, his face reddening. He had expected this to be a simple back and forth, a legal exchange where his authority would easily overpower a political newcomer. But Jasmine wasn't just attacking his rulings. She was attacking his very identity, his legacy, his claim to be an impartial defender of the law. Jasmine leaned in, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "The law isn't about abstract principles, Justice Kavanaugh. It's not about protecting the status quo. It's about people. It's about real lives. It's about ensuring that every single person in this country has access to the same protections, the same opportunities, the same justice. And right now, that is not happening. Your decisions have shown that you are more concerned with maintaining power than with delivering justice." The room held its breath. Kavanaugh had no immediate response. The weight of her words pressed down on him, suffocating him in a way he had never experienced. His eyes flickered with frustration as he prepared to speak, but Jasmine wasn't done. She had made her case, but now she was going to expose the truth he had worked so hard to hide. "And it's not just your decisions that are the problem, Justice Kavanaugh," she continued, her voice rising, now filled with the conviction of someone who had spent her life fighting for the truth. "It's your silence in the face of injustice. Your refusal to confront the systems of oppression that you've been a part of for so long. You've ignored the voices of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the ignored. You've allowed a system that rewards the wealthy, the privileged, and the powerful to continue unchallenged." Kavanaugh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it almost seemed like he might break, like he might finally admit the truth that Jasmine had exposed. But then, with a deep breath, he regained his composure. He was still Justice Kavanaugh, and he still believed that he was the one who had the law on his side. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. "You've had the privilege of being a judge for years, of sitting in a position where your decisions shape the lives of millions," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But you've never had to live under the laws you've created. You've never had to fight to survive in a system that was designed to keep you down, to make sure that people like you never have to worry about where their next meal is coming from or whether their rights will be respected. You've never had to fight for your place in this country." The room was quiet now, the weight of her words sinking in. Kavanaugh's expression had hardened, but there was no denying the discomfort in his eyes. He wasn't just facing a legal challenge anymore. He was facing a reckoning, one that was shaking the very foundation of the system he had spent his life defending. Jasmine's gaze softened for a brief moment, but the fire behind her eyes never faded. "The truth is, Justice Kavanaugh, you are not just an individual man. You represent everything that is wrong with this system. You represent the power, the privilege, and the arrogance that has kept this country from achieving its true potential. But that ends now." There was a moment of silence, a moment where time itself seemed to hold its breath. The world outside the courtroom may have seemed distant, but in this space, on this stage, everything was on the line. The clash between two ideologies, two visions of America, had reached its boiling point. The future was waiting to be shaped in that very room. Kavanaugh's face, once filled with defiance, was now masked in something different. A quiet realization. He wasn't a figure of unassailable authority anymore. Jasmine had exposed the cracks in his armor, and there was no turning back. "And that's why," Jasmine concluded, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering, "we will fight until the very last breath to ensure that justice is for everyone, not just the ones who have always had it." It was a mic drop moment. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Kavanaugh knew the battle wasn't just about winning a case. It was about losing something far more important, the belief that power alone could control the truth. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, it was as if the world outside had come to a halt, holding its breath along with everyone in the room. Kavanaugh sat there, rigid, staring straight ahead, unable to speak. The weight of Jasmine's words had hit harder than anything he had anticipated. And for the first time, it seemed as if the truth had taken root in the very space he occupied, a truth that he could no longer deny. Jasmine stood, unwavering, her presence commanding the room. There was no triumph in her posture, no gloating. She wasn't here for validation. She was here to expose the injustices that had been hidden behind the veil of authority. Her words were a weapon, and she had used them with precision. Outside the courtroom, the world was already reacting. Within minutes, the headlines hit. The reporters, who had been scribbling frantically throughout the hearing, were now glued to their screens, their fingers typing faster than ever. Jasmine's takedown of Kavanaugh wasn't just a legal victory. It was a political earthquake, a confrontation that would be remembered for years to come. Her words, her challenge, had ignited something larger than the courtroom debate itself. It had sparked a nationwide conversation. On Twitter, The hashtag Justice for All began trending. It was followed by a flood of tweets from political commentators, activists, and ordinary citizens alike, all echoing Jasmine's call for a more equitable legal system. Some tweets celebrated her courage, while others were filled with outrage at Kavanaugh's arrogance and hypocrisy. Jasmine Crockett obliterates Kavanaugh's defense of the status quo. "This is what real leadership looks like," one tweet read. Another added, "Kavanaugh's face says it all. He knows he's lost this battle." But it wasn't just social media. The news outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as a moment of reckoning for the Supreme Court justice. Interviews were scheduled, panel discussions organized. News anchors, normally reserved, couldn't contain their shock as they replayed the pivotal moments of the hearing, emphasizing the explosive tension between the two figures. "This was more than just a debate about the law," one anchor stated. "It was a clash of ideologies, a battle between progress and preservation, and Jasmine Crockett didn't just win the argument. She exposed the system for what it is." Meanwhile, Jasmine's phone buzzed nonstop. Supportive messages from colleagues, from friends, from activists. Some texted her directly, others sent public shout-outs. "You made history today," one message read. "You gave a voice to the voiceless. The people are with you." Her inbox overflowed with media requests and interview offers, but Jasmine ignored them all. She wasn't in this for the fame. She was in this to make a difference, to build something that could outlast the headlines, something that would force a change. This was only the beginning. But even as Jasmine basked in the emotional aftershock of the hearing, Kavanaugh wasn't the only one left to face the consequences. The political ramifications of this clash were already spreading like wildfire. Congressional leaders, many of whom had been silently critical of Kavanaugh for years, began to speak out. Senators, previously hesitant to challenge the powerful figures on the Supreme Court, now saw an opportunity to push for reforms, to demand accountability, transparency, and a more progressive approach to the law. The American people deserve a justice system that represents them, not just the powerful few, one senator said in a public statement. "We are at a crossroads, and today, Jasmine Crockett made it clear that we can't afford to wait any longer for change." Even Kavanaugh's allies in the political world couldn't ignore the growing public backlash. Behind closed doors, there were whispered discussions. Was it time for him to reconsider his stance? Should he try to make amends for his past decisions? Or would he continue to double down on his conservative ideology, regardless of the consequences? Kavanaugh's own response, however, was telling. The man who had once been so unflappable now appeared weary, retreating into the silence he had used as a shield throughout his career. But it was clear the pressure was mounting. The spotlight was on him, and for the first time, it was no longer a spotlight of admiration. It was one of scrutiny. Meanwhile, the public's perception of Jasmine grew even more powerful. A social media influencer with millions of followers tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just laid bare everything wrong with the system. This is leadership. This is courage. This is what we need in the future." A wave of support surged through the streets. Activists organized rallies, people gathered at town halls, and petitions to reform the judicial system circulated faster than ever before. And then, as if to put an exclamation point on it all, an unexpected endorsement came in from a very familiar figure. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had long been a champion of progressive causes, publicly declared her admiration for Jasmine's actions. What Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't just confrontational, it was revolutionary, Warren said in an impassioned tweet. She stood up for those who have been ignored by this system. It's time for all of us to follow her lead. By the end of the week, Jasmine's name was on everyone's lips. But more than her name, it was her message that resonated. She had given a voice to the people who had been marginalized for far too long. She had exposed the cracks in the foundation of the legal system, and now there was no going back. The shockwaves of that courtroom confrontation would ripple outward for years. The country had seen the truth, and it could never be unseen. Jasmine Crockett had done more than challenge Kavanaugh. She had ignited a revolution in the way the nation viewed justice. And in that moment, as the aftermath unfolded, She knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The days following the courtroom showdown felt like a whirlwind. The world had watched, and the country was still reeling from the emotional and political upheaval that Jasmine Crockett had sparked. Headlines continued to dominate the news cycle. Social media buzzed with debate, and the political landscape was shifting in ways that no one had anticipated. But amidst the noise, Jasmine knew that the real battle had just begun. She had exposed the truth. She had shaken the system to its core. But now the question was, what would come next? Jasmine stood before a crowd of supporters days after the hearing, her heart still heavy with the weight of the moment. The victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to every single person who had been silenced by a system that was never designed for them. It was the victory of the marginalized, the voiceless, the ones who had spent years fighting to be seen. And it was only the beginning. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and began to speak. What we did in that courtroom wasn't just a fight for one case. It wasn't about one individual ruling or one Supreme Court justice, she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with the power of truth. What we did was show the world that justice, real justice, is not for the privileged few. It is for everyone. It is for those whose voices have been silenced, whose rights have been trampled, and whose lives have been ignored by a system that was designed to protect the powerful. Her words reverberated through the crowd, the intensity of the moment undeniable. People were listening, people were connecting with her message, and for the first time in a long time, they felt that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. But let's be clear, Jasmine continued, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. This isn't about one person. This isn't about Kavanaugh or any other individual. This is about the system. This is about the institutions that have failed us for generations. And until we can break down the walls that divide us, until we can create a system that works for every single person in this country, we won't rest. We will keep fighting, because this is not just my fight. It is all of our fight. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the air undeniable. But as much as Jasmine appreciated the support, she knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't just here to win one battle. She was here to rewrite the entire narrative of justice in America. To do that, she would need more than just the applause of today. She would need to change the very systems that had allowed people like Kavanaugh to thrive. She reflected on her parents' sacrifices, the lessons they had taught her about fighting for what's right, about never backing down even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Her mother, who had dedicated her life to teaching children who didn't have the resources they needed. Her father, who had worked long hours to ensure his family could survive. They had never given up, and neither would she. But Jasmine also understood something that many others didn't. True justice doesn't come from the courts alone. It doesn't come from the politicians who promise change but fail to deliver. It comes from the people. It comes from the individuals who refuse to accept the status quo, who refuse to sit quietly while others are oppressed. The fight for justice is not a sprint. It is a marathon, Jasmine said, her voice now more resolute than ever. It is a fight that requires all of us. It's not about me. It's not about any one person. It's about building a movement that will stand the test of time. It's about changing the way we see each other, about recognizing that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, deserves the same rights and protections. Her message was clear. Justice wasn't something that could be handed down from the top. It was something that had to be fought for every single day. She had made an impact, no doubt about it, but she knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. The forces she had challenged, the political establishment, the legal system, the entrenched power structures, weren't going to back down easily. But neither would she. We've shown that the truth cannot be ignored. We've shown that the voices of the people matter. We've shown that the law is not a shield for the powerful. It is a tool for justice, Jasmine said, her eyes scanning the crowd, meeting the gaze of every person who had come to support her. Now, it's up to all of us to continue this fight, to ensure that the system we build is one that truly works for everyone. Because in the end, this isn't about one case. It's about a country, a nation, that can finally say, without hesitation, that justice is for all. The crowd cheered, the energy swelling as people raised their hands in solidarity. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, there was a sense that real change was within reach. Jasmine's voice had become a rallying cry for those who had been ignored for too long, and the movement she had started was only growing stronger. As she left the stage, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a quiet, steady sense of fulfillment. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she had already changed the conversation. She had forced the nation to confront its flaws, and now, the true work, the work of creating a just, equal, and fair system, would begin. Justice, she knew, would not come easily. But with every step, with every fight, they were getting closer. And that was a promise she intended to keep. As the crowd began to disperse, the noise of the rally slowly faded into the background, but Jasmine Crockett's words remained etched in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jasmine knew the world was watching. She could feel the weight of the movement she had ignited. What had started as one woman standing up in a courtroom had grown into something much larger. It was a reminder that no matter how much power or influence one person held, the collective will of the people who had been silenced for far too long, was unstoppable. Jasmine stepped away from the podium, her voice still echoing in the air, as if the very fabric of the nation was shifting beneath her feet. The future, once unclear and uncertain, now felt tangible, reachable. It was a future where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right. A future where those in power couldn't hide behind their positions of influence anymore. A future where the truth would no longer be buried. But that future wasn't guaranteed. It required action, it required persistence, and it required all of them. "We've started something," Jasmine said, her voice calm yet firm, as if speaking directly to the hearts of every person watching. "Now it's your turn. This movement, this fight, it needs each and every one of you. The work doesn't end here. If you believe in justice, if you believe in equality, if you believe that every voice matters, then stand with us." Her gaze swept across the crowd once more. Together, we can create a future where justice isn't just a word we say. It's a reality for all. Join us. Be part of the change. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett turned the page, ready to continue her fight for a more just world. But this time, she wasn't alone. Subscribe, share, and be part of the movement. The journey is just beginning.